We are talking today with Arjun Makhijani. Arjun Makhijani is president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He has testified before Congress and appeared on national television news outlets including ABC, CBS, BBC, and CNN. He has written numerous articles that have appeared in such publications as The Washington Post, The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Technology Review, World Policy Journal, Chemical and Engineering News, and The Progressive. He is the principal author of the first study ever done on energy conservation potential in the U.S. economy, the first global analysis of energy and agriculture in the Third World, and the first independent assessment of radioactivity emissions from a nuclear weapons plant. He is also the author of numerous books, including Nuclear Wastelands, a global guide to nuclear weapons production and its health and environmental effects, Ecology and Genetics, an essay on the nature of life and the problems of genetic engineering, Mending the Ozone Hole, Science, Technology, and Policy, co-authored with Kevin Gurney. And he is here to talk about his new book, Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy. If you would begin, could you briefly tell us a little bit about the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research?
Yeah, the Institute is a small nonprofit institute just outside of Washington, D.C. And we have two goals. We have a substance goal, which is to produce technically excellent studies on energy and environmental questions, on related security issues, like what happened to all the nuclear materials at the end of the Cold War. And we also have a process goal. That is, we want to write and research important technical subjects in a language that can be understandable to the public. We call it the democratization of science. Unless the public has a good grip on scientific issues, I don't think democracy can work well. Public needs to be informed, so that's part of our purpose.
And tell us, what was the motivation in writing your new book, Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy?
Well, a few years ago, it became clear to me, having worked on ozone depletion in the 80s, and at a certain point, the scientific data accumulates to a critical point, at least for me. It's a different point for everybody, but in the ozone crisis, it was the ozone hole in 1985 and the Ozone Trends Panel report in 87, where it became clear that the crisis would be worse than you thought and much faster than you thought. And a few years ago, I had the same feeling about climate, that the data had now accumulated, that it was reasonably certain that it will be worse than you thought and faster than you thought. So I wanted to make a contribution, having worked in energy for so many years, decades. And then the specific trigger for this book was a speech by my former boss and mentor, S. David Freeman, who was really the father of energy policy in this country. He used to be chairman of TVA, and he's currently the president of the board of harbor commissioners in Los Angeles. And he made a speech saying we should get rid of oil, we should get rid of coal, we should get rid of nuclear, and go to solar energy. That was 2 years ago. And I went up to him and I said, Dave, you're going to send every industry we have left to China because this is going to be a very expensive solution. And he said, you should do the technical work. You have jumped to a conclusion here. And I hadn't been looking at energy closely in many years. I've been worrying about nuclear waste. And so I agreed to do this study, and actually I was personally surprised to come to the conclusion that we could get rid of fossil fuels and nuclear power in 30 to 50 years. I wasn't ready to, but that's what the research shows. That's the state of the technology. So in a way, I became inadvertently a messenger of hope in the middle of the climate crisis.
Talk about the information that you gathered from this. What are the options for renewables?
Well, before we go to the renewables, let me say that the foundation of this has to be efficiency. We use energy really wastefully. Technically, I'm not talking about our personal habits. My book is not based on the idea that we're going to become more virtuous or wear sweaters or, the argument between the Cheney and the environmentalists isn't going to be settled. I assume it isn't going to be settled. So it's a very conventional framework. But that said, I think wind energy is already more economical than nuclear energy, new nuclear power plants. the wind energy technology began to mature about 20 years ago, and it's now a fully mature industry. I don't believe it needs any subsidies, actually, even. Solar energy is now reaching the stage where the wind energy business was in the late 80s. It's reaching the stage of maturity. The big shakeout between the various approaches hasn't happened yet, but it is happening. And I think in about 5 years, solar energy is going to be cheaper than nuclear energy. So nuclear energy has so many headaches. I thought, why do we need to go there if we can avoid it? And just to give you an idea of the size of the resources involved, Texas alone has more wind energy potential than all 104 nuclear power plants in the United States combined. The land-based wind energy potential in the Midwest and Rocky Mountain states is about 2.5 times the total electricity generation. Solar energy is much more plentiful than wind. We could supply most U.S. electricity requirements just from the area on commercial rooftops and parking lots. So one of the bumper stickers from my book is "Parking lots are the answer." You never thought well of parking lots, but actually that is beginning to take off in a very, very big way. People are realizing that the real estate on top of commercial buildings and in parking lots could be a large part of the foundation of the renewable energy economy.
And did you look at any other renewables besides the wind and solar?
I did. So wind and solar are very important to the electricity system. They are intermittent, and so it would be important to think through what might be available 24 hours a day. So solar thermal power plants with storage, for example, where you store the heat in molten salt and hot oils, so you can generate at night. I looked at that. That's now actually becoming rapidly economical, and big plants are being built in the United States after a long hiatus. I looked at geothermal energy. There's a new kind of geothermal energy called hot rock. There's a lot of hot rock under the surface. We don't have a lot of hot water geothermal resources, but you can inject fluids down into the earth, heat them up, and then generate electricity with the heat that's collected in those liquids. I looked at biomass. Now, biomass is a very tricky thing that we have to look at very closely, and it can play an important role in our energy economy, but we need to be very careful. This idea of turning corn into ethanol and food into fuel is a very bad idea. It doesn't do a whole lot for climate, if anything, and it's already caused a big problem in food prices around the world. You now see in the papers every day appeals for more food aid, and food prices have soared. That's not the only reason food prices have soared, of course. There is the growing wealth in China and India and so on, and greater demand for food, which is not a bad thing. People are coming out of poverty and demanding more food and eating better. That's a good thing. But turning food into fuel is a bad idea. But there are approaches to biofuels that could be much better.
What about things like bio-waste?
Yeah, now, the waste part of it, you have to be a little bit careful about. It's like turning corn stalks and, cellulosic ethanol, much talked about. You have to remember you can only use part of that because, first of all, there's a question of returning the nitrogen to the soil. There's a question of holding the soil together. There's a question of what you do when you dig up everything too frequently in terms of the carbon stored in the soil. And then there's a question of the magnitude of the resource. The magnitude of the resource from waste residues is not very large. So it could make a contribution in principle, but it's not very large. If you look at the whole energy economy, not just transportation, people tend to get fixated on, well, what about gasoline for our cars? Well, gasoline for personal vehicles is a large part of the petroleum sector, but it's not the majority of the petroleum sector. Majority of the petroleum sector is involved in other parts of transportation, like aircraft, for example, large trucks, pipelines, and also in industry. We use a very large amount of liquid and gaseous fuels as feedstocks to make plastics, for example, tires, and as fuel in industry to make steam, which is needed for chemical reactions to produce all the different things we consume. So when you worry about all of those things, the size of the waste resource is very small, and potential downsides of really exploiting that resource fully could be significant. So I think we have to, my approaches to biofuels is my other bumper sticker. Weeds are the answer. Aquatic weeds specifically. Now, one reason we don't like weeds when we garden is they grow prolifically and take over everything else. But that same property could be very useful for energy. They grow prolifically on anything. They also grow in wastewater. Aquatic weeds will grow in wastewater. Water hyacinths, duckweed, microalgae. So you could actually use them to clean up wastewater. They soak up the extra nutrients, which then, create algal blooms and all kinds of problems when they reach rivers and oceans. And I'll give you a concrete example. Okay, Los Angeles gets its water, a lot of its water, from the Owens Valley, northeast, and there's an agreement that dates back 100 years where the water is channeled into this aqueduct and goes to Los Angeles, and the valley has turned much more desertic, and the Owens Lake, which is a huge lake, turned into brine basically because of that water diversion. Los Angeles could send its wastewater back to Owens Valley. That wastewater could be cleaned up with aquatic plants. It needs some land area, sunshine. And then you could put it back into Owens Lake and have Owens Lake back, or reuse the water after purifying it, and reduce the demands on water as well as the discharges of nutrients where they're not needed. Just to give you an idea, corn into ethanol will produce a few hundred gallons of fuel an acre. Microalgae into ethanol can produce 10,000 gallons an acre. That's how prolific they are. So you don't need that much land area. So I think we have to be careful and thoughtful about our approaches to biofuels, and especially marry them to the solution of our wastewater and other environmental problems. And I think then we can probably manage it well. It's going to be hard, but we can do it.
So in terms of the solutions you see available, would most of them be larger scale projects at a community or, like statewide level, or is there ones that would be implemented at the, let's say, household level?
Well, at the household level, the main thing that needs to be done at the building level, whether it's household or commercial buildings, is we need to have different standards for buildings. I was just, I'm a guest of Dave Hall's, and he was showing me his house, and he bought his house in a typical way, same way that I bought my house, and maybe that you bought your house, which is you go in and you see something truly beautiful, or you see a kitchen that you've always wanted, the kind of house that will become a home for you, that you would love to live in. And for him, it was that breakfast nook that's very sunny and that looks out over the Cascades. For me and my wife, it was the large kitchen that was very sunny and airy, and azaleas outside and cherry blossoms. And that's the way it should be. That's a good thing. But as a result, developers have absolutely no interest in making an efficient house. They want to make the kind of house that you and I would fall in love with when we walk in. Okay, but then you pay the electricity bills and the fuel bills and the heating bills and the air conditioning bills. We need BTU per square foot standards. So many BTU per square foot and no more, and those need to be tightened. I'll give you an example. The average energy consumption per square foot in a typical residence is 58,000 BTU per square foot per year. Hanover House in New Hampshire, which is a pretty cold place, it's a well-built house, did not cost much to build, $111 a square foot, but it was built thoughtfully. It was built with thick walls, high solar thermal mass, as they say, that when the sun shines on it, it soaks up the heat and retains it for a couple of days. So it can still heat the house. The walls will heat the house when the sun isn't shining. It's a large solar water heater with a 1,000-gallon buried tank. It's his main source of space heating and water heating. And the rest he gets from electricity from the grid. He has no solar photovoltaics and nothing fancy. Just a well-built house with a solar water heater. His energy use from the outside, from the grid, is 8,000 BTU per square foot. 1/7. I believe that well-built buildings, commercial and residential, could eliminate most of their energy requirements by being properly built and having the right solar thermal equipment there in most areas of the country. Of course, in Seattle, a little bit harder since you have so much rain and less sunshine. But most of the energy requirements are actually created by wasteful and thoughtless building. And the individual homeowner, now with the way energy prices are, probably could save money by improving the efficiency of their house. You could also backfit things like solar thermal water heaters. And you know, there are in many states, I haven't looked at Washington, but there are in many states incentive programs for solar water heaters, for solar photovoltaics, so you could generate, I think you do have that in Washington state. You could generate your own electricity and hook it up to the grid and do reverse metering and so on. And there are many places that now have very good rate structures that can actually be quite beneficial for you to do that. So individual homeowners can do things. Renters have a more difficult time. And there, I think, the role for government could be significant because they have to make landlords do better by renters. You know, some landlords probably do very well, but others don't. And that is simply a matter of sad fact. And they need to be. It's the same kind of problem. The landlord doesn't pay the energy bill. He has no interest in investing in it. So we have to have kind of rules in society. Oh, sorry. Ooh, that was bad. We have to have rules in society for earth safety. I point out that we have rules for fire safety. We have rules for wiring safety. We have rules for gas safety. We have rules for water, you know, but we have no rules to protect the commons in which we all live. And now the climate crisis is really very serious, and we have to take it extremely seriously. My friend Helen Caldecott, who also inspired this book, it was her conference at which Dave made that speech. She says the planet is in intensive care. She's a doctor, and I agree with her. The planet is in intensive care. And if you take the analogy farther, you realize that when we have somebody we love in intensive care, we actually agree to do many things should be done to them that we would never do in normal circumstances. We have to, you know, we may have to look at a view we don't like. We may not like how wind turbines look. I personally do. But even if you don't, just remember the planet is in intensive care. If your children don't like the wind turbine, they can take them down and recycle the steel. But we shouldn't be putting sources of pollution out of sight just because we don't like the view. So we'll get nuclear power plants and we'll kick plutonium down the street to our kids. I don't think that's a very good idea just because we don't look at the factory that makes the plutonium, which is a nuclear reactor. So we have a problem of the commons here, and I think we haven't thought about it in the right framework. And I think Helen has the right framework. Planet is in intensive care, and we do things to get out of. You don't lecture people about you've smoked too much, that's why you got lung cancer. That's not the right time. So in a way, I appreciate the values discussion, and I wear a sweater, my house is cool in the winter and warm in the summer, you know. But we can have that argument, but it's not the time to settle this argument. We don't have the time. We need to turn the energy picture around and reduce carbon dioxide emissions yesterday. So we need to get things going as rapidly as possible, because the more data accumulates, actually, the worse it looks. It doesn't look good. So we need to get those wind turbines built, even if you don't like the view.
Have you done any estimates on what the economic costs would be to do all this?
Yes. Now, that was another one of the surprises, because my initial reaction to Dave's speech was, this is going to be very expensive. But just to give you some numbers, the net consequence, you have to do it right. We can't be screwing this up because it's a $1.5 trillion sector of the U.S. economy. And, it's 4 or 5 times that big globally. So we're talking many trillions of dollars. That's a pretty big thing to mess around with. We're going to make some mistakes, but I don't think we can afford big mistakes. So the main thing to do, as I said, is we need efficiency for buildings, efficiencies for appliances, and efficiencies for vehicles. Actually, we haven't talked about cars and vehicles at all. And I think plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles and vehicle-to-grid, where you kind of store electricity in your vehicles for the electric grid to operate. That's a very important part of the future. But with the right government incentives and policies, I think that we will not be spending a greater percentage of our GDP on energy than we have in the past. So we spend about 8% of our GDP on energy. Typically, it has varied between 6 and 14% over the last 30-odd years. In the crisis times, it's probably more than 8% now. It's probably 10 or 11% now, I think, in the last year or so. My calculations indicate that if you invest in efficiency first, because it's so economical to do it even at yesterday's energy prices, that we would be saving quite a lot of money. Our total electricity and energy bills would go down. The balance of the money is spent on investments in efficiency. So we'd pay more per unit of electricity, for solar electricity maybe, but because we'd be using much less, our total bill would go down, and the difference we would be investing in better homes, better buildings, better vehicles. And, obviously it's not a perfect crystal ball that I have. People have felt that we would be spending more on renewable energy if we go to a clean energy future. I actually don't think we would if we did the right things. And that doesn't even count the immense health benefits, for instance, of getting rid of fossil fuels, all the air pollution, getting rid of the asthma and the respiratory diseases and the children who can't play outside Los Angeles and Houston. All of those things are benefits that I haven't, not to speak of the $1 trillion we've spent on war, which Alan Greenspan has said is large. The war in Iraq is largely about oil. I think that's an exact quote from his book. Not counting all of those benefits, the amount we would spend on energy services, that is heating, cooling, refrigeration, moving from one place to another, would, I think, remain about this. The proportion would remain about the same. We'd be consuming more if the economy grows. We'd have more money to spend on everything, including energy services, but we won't be spending a greater proportion on energy services.
All right, only a few minutes left. So if you were suddenly put in charge of the U.S. energy policy, what things would you immediately institute to bring about these changes?
Here's what I would do. I would abolish subsidies for nuclear energy and fossil fuels, first of all. They've been around for a long time. They don't need subsidies. We're giving them billions of dollars. If they want to build nuclear power plants, let them go to Wall Street and raise the money. And Wall Street doesn't like nuclear power plants and don't want to invest them. That's why nuclear industry is largest hat in hand in Washington. So that's the first thing. I would also get rid of subsidies for food and fuel. I think that's a bad idea. The second thing that I would do is for large users of fossil fuels to put a national cap, not individual user caps, a national cap. Users that buy more than 100 billion BTU of fossil fuels that emit 7,000 tons of CO2 per year or more, they would be subject to a national cap. The U.S. Treasury would auction allowances, 4 billion this year, 100 million less next year, inexorably less every year. I call it the hard cap going to zero. So if you're DuPont or Dow or, an electricity company that uses coal, you have to go to the market and buy allowances. And next year they're going to be less, and you know that. So you're either going to invest in cleaner technology, or you're going to be spending a lot more and you'll be pushed out by your competition. And the United States should announce by 2050 we're going to have zero emissions from fossil fuels. And knowing that there's a date certain and an emission amount certain of zero, that would set the stage for the energy changes, the revolutionary changes in energy that we need. And then we should start implementing it now. So auctioning these, then the government would have the money to invest in research, to bring that hydrogen from solar energy into the marketplace, to expand the National Renewable Energy Lab budget, to create demonstration plants of the size that we need. For small users, small businesses and individuals, I would have building standards that I've talked about, BTU per square foot. I would have appliance standards, and I would have vehicle standards and incentives. So, for example, I think plug-in hybrids should be the standard issue government car by 2015. And the purchases should just increase. The Pentagon should put up solar photovoltaics on its parking lot and rooftop so that everybody who goes in and out of National Airport in Washington, D.C. can see it. This is the solution. Southern California Edison is, I think it's Southern California Edison. They've decided to undertake the largest solar photovoltaic project in the country so far, 240 megawatts of solar energy on commercial rooftops. Don't need transmission lines. It's already right where the energy is being used. That would provide the framework for, those few things can provide the framework for actually transforming the energy economy of the United States, provide the government with the revenue. Now, there will be dislocations in some communities. I think the new energy infrastructure should preferably be created in communities where there's the old energy infrastructure. So Houston, instead of servicing offshore oil rigs, should be servicing offshore windmills. This is not, an environmentalist fantasy. They're already beginning to do that in Scotland, where the North Sea oil is playing out. They're converting some of their infrastructure to. We need to wake up the auto industry. We really do. And I think part of that wake up needs to be the stick of standards, but there also needs to be an incentive. If the government will say plug-in hybrids will be our standard car, the government buys, I think state, local, and federal governments buy about 300,000 cars a year. That's, I'm not 100% sure if I'm remembering the number right, but it's on that order. And that's a pretty big market. And then you can actually do vehicle-to-grid technology. You park your car under that solar canopy. It's parked in the shade, very nice, doesn't get hot, need less air conditioning. You plug it in, and the grid operator then can charge and discharge your battery depending on the needs of the grid. And the new batteries that are being developed, the lithium-ion batteries, are the kind of batteries that will enable this kind of technology to happen. So we have a technological revolution in the making, but unfortunately we don't have a policy revolution yet. But that's what I would do.
Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Mike.
We have just been talking with Arjun Makhijani. He is president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research and author of the new book, Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy. And if you'd like further information, you can go to their website, ieer.org.